With 2022 squarely in the rearview mirror, it's time to look back at the year in gaming. There were some big triumphs, some disappointments, and some substantial delays, with quite a few major titles pushed into 2023. While last year wasn't an especially strong year for gaming in my view, there were some top quality experiences, and today I'd like to take you through my top 5 titles of the year. I'll also close with some reflections on the year and a look ahead to 2023. As always, this is my personal list and doesn't reflect anyone's opinions but my own. Number 5. Horizon Forbidden West. Horizon Forbidden West is a fantastic game on so many levels. The world design is impeccable, the story is captivating, and the game content is consistently high quality. Guerrilla took what worked well in Horizon Zero Dawn and expanded it into a larger, more interactive open world. And they addressed most of the faults from the first game very effectively, in particular massively improving the quality of most dialogue sequences. Obviously, the visuals do deserve particular praise. Most cross-gen efforts this year have a very clear origin on 8th gen consoles, but Horizon uses procedural placement systems alongside a lot of high-quality assets to boost detail levels well beyond almost anything else. It's a hugely impressive effort, producing perhaps the most visually exciting open world I've ever seen. Guerrilla's post-launch support has been appreciated as well. Through major improvements to their TAA systems, image quality in the performance mode in particular is so much better now than when the game shipped. And of course, the upcoming Burning Shores expansion seems very appealing as well. At the same time, I do think that the combat, while definitely improved from Zero Dawn, isn't quite up to the level that it maybe should be. Perhaps this just comes down to personal taste or a bit of open world fatigue, but the combination of RPG systems and action combat, while enjoyable, didn't quite click with me in this game a lot of the time. But I did enjoy Forbidden West's other elements to more than make up for those quibbles, so it comes in at number 5 on this list. Number 4. Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Kirby's first full 3D adventure is a fun and inventive platformer that really surprised me. It's sort of a linear, fixed camera platformer in line with something like Super Mario 3D World, but it comes with a surprisingly broad scope. When Forgotten Land landed in March, I blasted through it in a couple of days and had an absolute blast. I love Nintendo's platformers, and this is definitely one of the best in recent memory. The way that they translated Kirby's moveset into 3D without losing any of the responsiveness of the 2D Kirby entries is key here, and it's really impressive stuff. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, as I think John did an excellent job in his coverage and his thoughts mostly mirror my own, so check out his video if you haven't already. There is one caveat to all this, of course, and that's the game's 30 FPS framerate cap. This wasn't hard to get used to ultimately, but I do wish that 60 FPS had been the target instead, which would have been in line with other Nintendo-published Switch platformers. But I do have to admit that this is probably my favorite Kirby game since Canvas Curse for the DS, and it's one of the best 3D platformers that is available for the Switch. So it comes in just outside the top 3 at number 4. Number 3. Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII Reunion. Game remasters and remakes sit on a spectrum. Towards one end, you have relatively basic remasters that consist of basic, simple upgrades, things like increased frame rate, resolution, and maybe some new texture assets. And on the other end, there are full-on top-to-bottom remakes, games that take characters, plot, and certain gameplay elements from the original game, but are otherwise completely new projects. Most remakes or remasters sit somewhere in the middle. A lot of older titles require substantial basic upgrades to work on modern displays at all really, or have artwork that only really functions on CRTs. Some games are recent enough to basically function okay with some limited upgrades, but benefit from new effects or assets that are relatively easy to plug into older software, updated post-processing for instance, or AI upscaled textures. Crisis Core Reunion is definitely a title that falls somewhere in that nebulous middle area, but in my view it's much closer to a remake than a remaster. The basic game structure is more or less identical to the original title, with unchanged level layouts and the same story, but the renderer has been replaced with Unreal Engine 4 and the lighting, post-processing, and other rendering characteristics are all new. That's obviously a great start, but as we've seen with other recent enhancements of older titles that have used this general model, the results aren't always up to par. But Square Enix and Tosei took the original assets and largely rebuilt them, sometimes hewing more closely to the original work, and sometimes handing in stylistically revamped art as well that lifts a lot from Final Fantasy VII Remake, which features some of the same environments. Very few remake projects are going to have the budget to comprehensively remake an older title's visuals, but this is basically the next best thing. The fact that the original animation work was very high quality probably helped a lot, as most of the animation in time-intensive areas of production, like cinematics, was able to be reused without any obvious quality issues. And the project benefited from new techniques that have changed the state of game remastering in general. AI video upscaling is an obvious example, producing more or less passable results by enhancing what looks like a standard definition class and code of the original CG content. With a project like this, fully remaking the original work was probably out of the question, so AI enhancement at least improves the video clips to the point where their heritage isn't usually obvious. Even with the very large gameplay revamp that we've seen here though, this is still a simple action RPG at heart. The digital Mindwave roulette system still feels like a fresh twist, but although the basic mechanics feel good, they aren't exactly anything new. You attack, you dodge, you cast spells, and keep an eye out for pretty plainly telegraphed enemy moves, which are often accompanied by warning text or a progress meter. But after so many recent action RPGs that have pushed dramatic, flashy, and complicated combat systems that look great but often don't work on a basic mechanical level, I really appreciated Crisis Core's back-to-basics fighting mechanics. It feels very grounded and everything makes sense, with no unfair moves or hits that come out of nowhere. The final results look, play, and feel hugely improved over the original title in just about every respect, and that's why I feel it deserves a spot on this list. And of course, that original game had an enormous amount to respect, including an excellent story and a lot of level variety, and those aspects are preserved very nicely. This isn't a wholly new title, but I do tend to think that more substantial game update projects deserve to be evaluated on their own terms, and that's why this comes in at number 3. Number 2, Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle was a pretty special early Switch title. It married XCOM-style combat with beautiful visuals, which were powered by Ubisoft's advanced Snowdrop game engine. I enjoyed the game quite a bit and beat it shortly after it released, but the combat mechanics were simple to a fault and most of the game's encounters were way too easy. As an opening effort on the Switch, it showed exactly what the console could accomplish when paired with a seasoned team working with sophisticated technology, and set the stage for future ambitious efforts on the console, but it still felt like the underlying formula needed some kind of expansion or shakeup. While it did take 5 years to arrive, Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope is a more or less perfect answer to my wishes. The combat adds additional complexity with a wide host of new, useful abilities and actions that genuinely make the game feel richer without adding bloat. Gameplay is flexible, fast, tactical, and fun in the way the original title simply wasn't, owing largely to changes in the movement system and to the addition of some real-time game elements. It also helps enormously that the combat actually requires you to engage with the game's basic systems this time around. Even on the default normal difficulty, there are some tough encounters with strategic play an absolute necessity. And the environments are much more interesting with open spaces, RPG-style quests, and conventional right-stick camera control. Kingdom Battle was carefully limited and curated to suit its retro-leaning aesthetics and isometric camera perspective, and this necessarily resulted in a reduced scope. Sparks of Hope pushes in the opposite direction, and it's a refreshing change of pace. Really, I loved Sparks of Hope, and I think Ubisoft did a fantastic job taking what worked about the original game and expanding it to make a proper full-fledged sequel that feels interesting and unique. In my original coverage, I did spend a lot of time on the game's visual presentation, and yes, that is an aspect that did let me down somewhat. But evaluated on its own terms, it's still a good-looking title, even if progress from that first game isn't always evident. Performance is also a sore spot, though exactly how much that matters in a turn-based game will be a matter of personal taste. But the strength of the underlying gameplay systems was more than enough to overcome any quibbles I had elsewhere. Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope is a profoundly improved sequel that I very much enjoyed playing, and that's why it comes in as my runner-up for 2022.
Back before winter set in, there were some misunderstandings. Regrettable ones. But I think we all have a better idea of who we're dealing with.
Number 1, God of War Ragnarok. I'm not going to spend too much time going over the basics, as I expect that most players will have a pretty good idea of what to expect from the game in general, especially if they have some experience with the prior entry. So I'm going to touch on a few areas from Ragnarok that surprised and impressed me. In a lot of ways, Ragnarok is just more God of War, but there are some key faults from God of War 2018 that have been improved massively for this title. The side quests or favors from God of War 2018 were often pretty limited, for instance. The locations you visited weren't particularly interesting, and there were only a small handful of reasonably long quests. There was some interesting additional side content for players who were deeply devoted to the game, like the Valkyrie challenges, but on the whole it was a respectable but slightly barren offering. God of War Ragnarok, in contrast, has so much more side content, and much of it comes in with comparable production values to the main story quests. There are interesting new places to explore, bold new enemies to fight, and captivating stories to hear. Some of the areas are devoted solely to side content, including a few spots that really open up as the game progresses. At this point, I've beaten most of the favors in Ragnarok, and both in quality and quantity, the improvements from God of War 2018 are enormous. God of War 2018 was famous for its world design, which straddled the line between linearity and an open world. While the player did have the freedom to navigate back and forth through a roughly contiguous open world, the actual gameplay spaces within that world had a relatively small scope. Ragnarok maintains the same basic structure but evolves the open environment to feel a lot less claustrophobic than before. The game has several major totally open spaces, which the player traverses with a sled or canoe and can approach freely, tackling side content more or less as you see fit. But critically, once you move into a cave or structure or island to complete that side content, the path forward is linear and carefully designed. It has elements of the open world freedom that can be so liberating when executed well in other games, while still maintaining excellent encounter design and pacing. Each favor becomes a 20-minute to 90-minute, perfectly curated excursion within a much larger world. This marries the best aspects of linear and open world RPG design in my opinion, though unfortunately a handful of questing zones are still a little bit too rigid and restrictive, like Vanaheim. The combat itself is similar to God of War 2018, but has new abilities and faster pacing overall, which feels like a really solid progression from that game. I felt like the puzzles were great as well. Ragnarok did engender a lot of criticism for its frequent puzzles and hint-heavy puzzle system, but I felt like they were very well done and improved the game's pacing quite a bit. If you do play reasonably well, I don't think the hints are too intrusive, or at least I rarely noticed them during my time with the game. Ultimately, whatever production processes they had internally really worked, because God of War Ragnarok is one of the most AAA games that I've ever played, and I mean that as a big compliment. The production values are just off the charts here. High quality assets are everywhere, animations are polished, there are so many complex cinematic sequences, and it really is just overflowing with dense, ambitious content. I loved the story from God of War 2018 and felt attached in a way that's pretty rare for me with most games. Ragnarok closes out that story in an emotionally wrought and remarkably well acted game. The scope of all the proceedings continues to impress here, with a richer cast of characters and a denser plot. And even though Ragnarok is a pretty thoroughly cross-gen game, it still looks excellent, with strong lighting and excellent visual design. Plus, the last-gen console versions are in great shape, which is something that we cannot say for the majority of releases this year. God of War Ragnarok is a really impressive achievement in my view, and it easily takes the top spot as my game of the year in 2022. Ragnarok was a much more enjoyable experience than basically anything else I played last year, and it's the kind of comprehensive big budget experience that shows what video games can be with enough time, resources, and craft. That's the end of my games of the year, but there are a handful of other titles that are worth mentioning as well. I played a lot of Grid Legends and Need for Speed Unbound, both of which are excellent arcade racers. I enjoyed Xenoblade Chronicles 3, Evil West, and Soul Hackers 2, and a handful of games that I sampled for coverage that I would like to complete, most notably the Callisto Protocol. Last year wasn't a bad year for gaming by any means, but I definitely do feel like 2021 was stronger, and it would have been easy to assemble a top 5 that I felt really great about in that year. The same applies to 2020, though that was such a strong year that limiting myself to a top 5 would have probably actually felt too restrictive. Now perhaps my tastes are a little bit too AAA centric, But the unfortunate reality is that a lot of key software that was planned for release this year got pushed into 2023. Perhaps as a result, there were some serious game release lulls in 2022, particularly in the summer months, and the holidays had fewer major titles than usual. Looking forward to this year, the calendar for major releases at the moment looks extremely promising, and there are a ton of games that I'm looking forward to. From Starfield to Spider-Man 2 to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI, Suicide Squad, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Forza Motorsport, and remakes of Dead Space and Resident Evil 4, it's hard to recall a year in recent memory that had such a volume of highly anticipated games. And most of the big titles next year are exclusive to current-gen consoles and PC. So I do expect to see some impressive looking software as we finally shed the restrictions of 8th-gen console hardware. So here's hoping that 2023 delivers the goods. And as always, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.